The spring of 1940 was not kind to the Duke of Windsor. He was 45 years old, living in exile in Paris, watching from across the Channel as Europe collapsed around him. 4 years had passed since he had signed away his crown for Wallace Simpson, and every one of those years had been a lesson in irrelevance. He had been a king. He had been an emperor. Now he was a house guest in a city about to fall to the Wehrmacht. German panzer divisions were smashing through the Ardennes. The Maginot Line was already irrelevant. Allied positions were collapsing by the hour. And Edward, the man who had once commanded the allegiance of a quarter of humanity, was packing suitcases and wondering where to flee next. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon actually was in May 1940. Not the elderly Queen Mother waving from balconies decades later. The woman at the peak of her influence. The woman who had watched her shy, stammering husband forced onto the throne because his brother wanted to marry an American divorcee with two living ex-husbands. The woman who had rendered judgment on that brother in December 1936 and never, not once, reconsidered it. This was not a passive figure. This was a woman who understood something fundamental about the monarchy's survival, and she understood what Edward's return would cost. Elizabeth had despised Wallace Simpson long before the abdication. She considered her vulgar, manipulative, a woman who had bewitched David into betraying everything he was supposed to represent. But Elizabeth's fury ran deeper than personal distaste. Her husband, Albert, the family called him Bertie, had never wanted to be king. He was shy. He stammered so badly that public speaking was physical torture. Where David was golden and charming, Bertie was awkward and uncertain. He had expected a quiet life, support his brother from the shadows, maybe govern some distant colony. Instead, on December 11, 1936, he found himself proclaimed George VI, 40 years old, a two-pack-a-day smoker. Already visibly aging under pressure he had never sought. Elizabeth watched her husband grind himself down under that weight. She counted every sleepless night, every stammered speech, every bout of exhaustion that left him gray and trembling, and she traced every moment of suffering back to one source: David, the brother who had walked away, the man who had condemned an unprepared king to carry a burden that would kill him. She told her grandson Prince Charles years later that she could never forgive Edward for his selfish abdication, knowing what sovereignty would cost her husband. This was not a grudge. Grudges fade. This was a verdict, final, permanent, maintained until her dying breath. But there was another dimension to Elizabeth's case against her brother-in-law. When Edward left Britain, he did not leave empty-handed. He took family jewels, heirlooms, pieces that had belonged to Queen Alexandra, to Queen Mary, to generations of royal women, emeralds and sapphires and diamonds that Elizabeth believed belonged to the crown, not to David personally. He had no right to them. He was a thief of state property, as far as she was concerned. The jewel dispute festered throughout the late 1930s, adding a financial insult to moral injury. Edward had abandoned duty. He had taken what was not his, and now he was living in Paris with Wallace, wearing stolen gems to dinner parties with people who made Elizabeth's blood run cold, because the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had spent the late 1930s cultivating friendships that would prove deeply embarrassing. They visited Nazi Germany in 1937, met Hitler, smiled for photographs alongside the man who would soon try to destroy Britain. Edward's sympathies were not hidden. British intelligence had been monitoring him with growing alarm. The Duke had told neutral diplomats that Britain could not win, that a negotiated peace with Germany was inevitable, that continued resistance was pointless. He was not just an embarrassment. He was a potential security catastrophe wearing stolen jewelry. Then came May 10, 1940. The German offensive exploded. Panzer divisions smashed through Allied lines. British and French forces retreated toward Dunkirk. The evacuation would begin at month's end. For Edward and Wallace, living comfortably in their Paris residence, the advancing Wehrmacht presented an immediate personal threat. They fled south, Biarritz first, then Spain. By early July, they had reached Lisbon, and from Portugal, Edward made his move. He contacted his brother through diplomatic channels. The message was simple. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. He wanted to come home. He wanted to serve. He was a prince of the blood, a former king, a man who had once been trained for nothing except leadership. "Give me a role," he asked. "Let me help defend the country I once ruled. Let me prove I have not abandoned my nation completely." The request arrived in London like a bomb. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, understood immediately that this was catastrophe dressed as family reunion. British intelligence had intercepted alarming communications. The Germans were not just watching Edward, they were actively interested in acquiring him. Within weeks, the Nazis would formalize something called Operation Willy, a plan to kidnap or persuade the Duke, use him as a puppet ruler if Britain fell. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop had stated it explicitly. Germany was determined to force England to peace by every means of power, and upon this happening would be prepared to accommodate any desire expressed by the Duke, especially with a view to the assumption of the English throne. The Nazis wanted Edward back on the throne, and Edward was in Lisbon, making defeatist statements to anyone who would listen, wearing his stolen emeralds, asking to come home. George VI received his brother's request amid this swirl of national emergency and intelligence panic. And here is where the story becomes something more than geopolitics, because despite everything, despite the abdication, despite the Nazi visit, despite the jewels, despite the years of tension, David was still his brother. Part of George missed him. Part of him felt guilty for inheriting what should have been David's birthright. Part of him wondered if reconciliation was possible, if the burden could somehow be shared, if having his brother beside him might ease the weight that was crushing him day by day. George VI was exhausted. He was stammering through speeches that required superhuman effort. He was smoking constantly, coughing, visibly deteriorating under strain he had never sought and never wanted. The thought of having David back, of sharing the spotlight, of not being alone in this impossible role must have been tempting, even knowing everything he knew, even understanding the risks. He was still Bertie, still the younger brother, still the man who had lived in David's golden shadow his entire life. But George VI was no longer just Bertie. He was king, and he had advisors, including the woman beside him every night, the woman who had watched him suffer for 4 years. The woman who blamed David for every moment of that suffering. The woman who had already rendered her verdict and had no intention of reconsidering it. What happened in the private rooms of Buckingham Palace during June and July 1940 remains one of the great mysteries of royal history. No diary entries survive. No letters detail Elizabeth's exact words. The specific ultimatum that some historians attribute to her cannot be verified from documentary evidence. But we know the outcome. George VI refused his brother's request. Edward would not return to Britain. The door that had cracked open amid France's collapse slammed shut with permanent force. The circumstantial evidence of Elizabeth's influence is overwhelming. She had established herself as George VI's most trusted advisor, the person whose judgment he relied upon when his own confidence failed. Biographer Sally Bedell Smith argues that Elizabeth understood her husband's psychological fragility as no one else did. She knew George was holding together through sheer will, managing his stammer, fighting his anxiety, projecting strength that a wartime nation required. She also knew exactly what Edward's presence would destroy. David was charming in ways George could never be. He was the king who should have been, the golden prince whose shadow George had inhabited his entire life. If David returned to London, if he appeared in uniform, if he demonstrated his natural ease with crowds and cameras, the contrast would be devastating. The court would remember who was supposed to be wearing the crown. The public would notice who looked more comfortable in the role. George VI would crack under the pressure of constant comparison, found wanting, every single time. Elizabeth added the moral dimension that made her case irresistible. This was not just about protecting George's fragile confidence. It was about protecting the institution itself. Edward had failed in his duty. He had taken the family jewels. He had consorted with Nazis. He had told diplomats that Britain would lose. And now he wanted to come home, wanted a role, wanted to be celebrated as the returning prince while wearing emeralds he had stolen from the crown, while the Germans were actively plotting to put him back on the throne, while British soldiers were dying on the beaches of Dunkirk. The very jewels that should have adorned Elizabeth's neck were decorating Wallis Simpson at parties in Paris and beyond. Every gem was an insult. Every request for reconciliation was an affront. Churchill handled the practical mechanics. The Prime Minister informed Edward that he was being appointed governor of the Bahamas, a position that provided an official role while keeping him thousands of miles from Britain and Nazi Europe. When Edward dragged his feet in Lisbon, still making defeatist statements, still hinting that perhaps a negotiated peace might be wise, Churchill's patience snapped. He threatened court-martial under military law if Edward did not proceed immediately to the Bahamas. The former king, who had once commanded the allegiance of a quarter of humanity, was being ordered about like a delinquent junior officer. The man wearing Queen Alexandra's stolen jewels was being shipped to the Caribbean like an embarrassing cousin best kept far from the action. Edward and Wallis departed Lisbon on August 1st, 1940, aboard the steamship Excalibur. They would not set foot in Britain again until Edward's funeral in 1972. The timing was grimly significant. In early August, the Luftwaffe began its campaign for air superiority over the English Channel. The Battle of Britain commenced. While Edward sailed toward Nassau, RAF pilots died defending the skies he had abandoned. British cities braced for the Blitz. The man who had once been king was absent for his nation's finest hour. His absence was Elizabeth's doing, and within weeks, she would prove exactly why she had been right. September 1940 brought the war to the monarchy's doorstep. London burned. On September 10th, the first bombs struck Buckingham Palace. One exploded beneath the king's study in early morning darkness. Then, September 13th, a second devastating attack. 6 high-explosive bombs hit different areas of the palace at approximately 11:10. George VI and Elizabeth were present. They narrowly escaped injury. A policeman died. The chapel was destroyed. The royal residence, symbol of British continuity, had been directly targeted by the enemy. The bombing transformed the royal family's wartime standing. Working-class neighborhoods of East London had been devastated by German bombs. There had been grumbling that the royal family was safe while ordinary people suffered. The bombing of Buckingham Palace eliminated that complaint. The king and queen were sharing the danger, staying in London, refusing to evacuate, demonstrating through physical presence that the crown would not abandon its people. The contrast with Edward could not have been more brutal. While George and Elizabeth toured bomb sites, comforting the wounded, inspecting ruins, wearing sensible clothes and determined expressions, Edward was in Nassau complaining about the air conditioning in Government House and the lack of sophisticated company. While British civilians huddled in underground stations during raids, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor attended garden parties. While George VI stammered through radio addresses that rallied the nation, Edward wrote letters speculating about German victory. While Elizabeth picked through rubble and pearls that actually belonged to her, Wallis wore stolen emeralds to Bahamian cocktail parties. Elizabeth understood the significance of these parallel stories with perfect clarity. Every photograph of her amid bomb damage was a rebuke to Edward's absence. Every report of the king visiting anti-aircraft batteries was an implicit comparison with the former king lounging in the Caribbean. The monarchy was being remade in war's crucible. The new model demanded duty, sacrifice, shared suffering. Everything Edward had rejected when he chose Wallis, everything he continued to reject when he took the jewels, everything he betrayed when he praised the Nazis. The young princesses played their role too. Elizabeth and Margaret were not evacuated to Canada like many upper-class children. They stayed in Britain, eventually at Windsor Castle, but within range of German bombers. Princess Elizabeth made her first public radio address in October 1940, speaking to evacuated children, telling them she and her sister understood separation. The royal family presented itself as a family, mother and father protecting their children, doing their duty, standing firm. Meanwhile, Edward and Wallis remained childless and far away. The former king had no children to protect, no family to shield, just a wife wearing jewels that did not belong to her. George VI did not live to see the full fruits of the moral authority he and Elizabeth built during the war. The strain of kingship, combined with decades of heavy smoking, destroyed his health. In September 1951, he underwent a left pneumonectomy, removal of his entire left lung, for what was officially described as structural abnormalities, but was actually cancer. The word itself was kept from him. Doctors believed the truth would be too distressing for a man already struggling under impossible weight. George VI died on February 6, 1952, at Sandringham House. 56 years old, the official cause was listed as coronary thrombosis, though modern analysis suggests lung cancer complications were the actual cause. Elizabeth, now the Queen Mother, assigned blame with cold precision. She never said so publicly, but those close to her understood. She held Edward responsible for the burden that had broken her husband. The logic was simple. If David had done his duty, George would never have been forced into a role that destroyed him. Every speech George struggled through, every public appearance that cost such effort, every night spent worrying about responsibilities he never sought, all traceable to December 1936 and David's choice. Add the stolen jewels, the continuing insult of seeing Wallis photographed in Alexandra's emeralds, and Elizabeth's judgment was total, unforgiving, permanent. Edward learned of his brother's death while at his New York home. He attended the funeral in London, his first return to Britain in 16 years, and was pointedly excluded from the family gathering at Sandringham that followed. The Duke of Windsor had become a ghost, a reminder of a past the royal family preferred to forget. He spent his remaining years in Paris, watching his niece, Elizabeth II, become the most respected monarch in British history. A woman who embodied the duty and sacrifice he had abandoned. Edward died on May 28, 1972, of throat cancer at his home near Paris. He was buried at Frogmore. The funeral was muted. Few mourners. Little public emotion. The Golden Prince, who had once been adored by millions, was laid to rest with more relief than grief. The Queen Mother attended Edward's funeral in black. Her face revealed nothing, not grief, not satisfaction, just the composed dignity that had become her trademark over 4 decades of public life. When asked in old age about reconciliation, she reportedly replied that there was nothing to reconcile. The judgment she had rendered in 1936 and enforced with such determination in 1940 had never wavered. David had failed his duty. He had consorted with Nazis. He had stolen the family jewels. George had paid the price for all of it. Elizabeth had protected her husband as best she could, and she had won. When the Queen Mother died on March 30th, 2002, at the age of 101, she was the most beloved royal figure of her generation. Crowds stretched for miles along her funeral route. The nation mourned with a depth of feeling that surprised even those who knew her popularity. She had earned that love through 65 years of public service, through the Blitz and post-war austerity and social transformation. She had earned it by standing firm when others faltered, by protecting her husband when he could not protect himself, by understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on moral authority that could not be faked or purchased. The irony of the Windsor story cuts deep. Edward's great sacrifice, giving up the throne for love, proved hollow. His marriage to Wallis lasted 45 years, but it was marked by dependence, disappointment, and exile. Meanwhile, the marriage of George VI and Elizabeth, which had seemed so ordinary compared to Edward's grand romantic gesture, proved to be the foundation on which the modern British monarchy was built. Elizabeth had understood something Edward never grasped. Love and duty were not opposites. Serving one's responsibilities to country and family was not a betrayal of the heart, but its highest expression. There is a final twist. The rigid moral standards Elizabeth defended with such ferocity would not survive the century. Divorced people now marry into the royal family. A king sits on the throne whose first marriage ended publicly and bitterly. The walls Elizabeth built have crumbled, but that makes her stand in 1940 more remarkable, not less. She was the last great defense of a code that the monarchy eventually abandoned, and she held that line when it mattered most, when the bombs were falling, when a Nazi sympathizer wearing stolen jewels wanted to come home. She said no in the summer of 1940. Britain was alone. The future was uncertain. The easy thing would have been forgiveness, reconciliation, give the former king a chance to redeem himself during his country's darkest hour. She said no. She was right. She never doubted it.